Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Unfollowing Mum. This is going to be a very snuffly episode, I think, because both myself and my guest have got a cold. There's this lovely cold that's been going around. Everybody seems to have it. We're all sinusy, we're all very nasal, but we're going to make it through. We are. We're going to power through it. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce my guest today. I'm really excited to chat to her, and it is Emma Benyon. Hi, how are you?
Hi, Harriet. Thank you for having me. Absolutely full of a cold as well as you.
I think
Uh,
it's just sod's law, isn't it? On the one day where you need to be able to talk, you need to be able to like have your brain functioning, you come down. And I keep thinking when I go to bed, I'm like, I'll be better tomorrow. Spoiler, I am not better tomorrow. So, can you tell listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yes, of course. So I'm a self-care and motherhood coach and educator. I'm also a full-time 16 plus teacher and a mum of a 6-year-old. My absolute passion is just to support busy mums with those kind of tools to support ourselves through those more challenging times so that we have this resource bank, that's think about it as an energy fuel tank that we need to keep topping up as we charge our phone, our laptop, as we might water the plants, um, etc. And that actually having that really beautiful toolkit means that we can access that and we can be resourced so that when we're navigating difficult situations, even when we're just navigating daily life, sometimes things just come completely out of the blue, don't they? And they get thrown at us and just so that we can navigate, in a way that actually we really do feel like us and that we have the energy to do the things that we want to do. We have the energy to communicate well, in our relationships, whether that's with our children, partners, friends, etc. And also, have that capacity to really put those boundaries in place for ourselves and to feel, that we have some balance. And I don't mean balance in terms of the scales are even,
Yeah.
that we have that kind of ease of, this is the priority right now. This is what's my focus. And I've got the resources to support myself through that and kind of knowing that that is probably going to change over time as well. So, for me, when I talk about self-care, self-care comes with that kind of massive like stigma, loads of all that stuff attached to it, doesn't it? Of actually,
Yeah.
all these shoulds and expectations and, well, I need this amount of time or it needs to be that. And actually, it just needs to be simple and easy for us, 2 minutes here, 5 minutes there, and things that are ultimately going to support our energy levels. Spa days and getting your nails done and getting your hair done is absolutely wonderful. Like all those things are absolutely
Yeah.
lovely. However, when we are busy, when we are navigating, difficult situations, when we are, navigating our daily life, actually, having those things once a week, once a month, however, is possibly for a lot of people really unachievable. So we need to think about it in a way that actually it's practical, it's supportive, and it's stuff that can be added in each and every day as and when we can.
I think that's really important because growing up as somebody who grew up in toxic family dynamics, you don't get those messages about self-care. Or if you do, they're somewhat resentful, or your parents so busy doing that, what we would think of as self-care and what the media push to us as self-care, that kind of spa day and doing that, I'm just going to lie in bed, that actually you end up becoming the parent. And there are some really negative messages that are sent to you sometimes around self-care, especially if you've grown up and been parentified and you've been the person who has had to take on the mantle of being the parent from when
Mhm.
you were very, very little. What are some of the things that you encourage people to do to self-care?
So I always start by this, just keep it super simple. And I think often when we are leading our lives, those things that perhaps we did before we became parents, like listening to music, they just fall to the bottom of the pile, don't
Mm,
they? And so if we are, for example, doing the washing, everybody has to do the washing. We can't escape that chore.
yeah.
Whether it's the washing up or whether it is doing the laundry, let's just put some music on while we do that. let's raise our energy. Let's put on our favorite playlist. Or if we want to listen to a podcast and that's more what we enjoy, let's put a podcast on or listen to an audiobook. We
Mm.
don't need to do those jobs and chores in silence. We could be having a kitchen disco while we're doing those jobs. And that, we're adding to what we're already doing. It's not becoming something additional. So it's not an additional, amount of time that we need to do that. Actually, we're already doing the washing. Let's just put some music on while we do that. Or we might want to, if we like to journal, we might want to journal. And I'm not talking about writing reams and reams every day. Let's look at how our day is set up. So, from my example, what I used to do is I used to try and journal in the morning before I left the house.
Mhm.
Let's be realistic. I've got a 6-year-old to get out in the morning. Like, that's not going to happen. And we're just adding those unrealistic expectations and pressures for what?
Mm. It ends up
Just,
becoming more of a stress then, doesn't
yeah,
it, to try and cram these things
absolutely.
in? And I say to clients all the time when they're talking about going through perhaps navigating estrangement or generational trauma breaking, and I'm constantly saying, journaling's a great thing. Journaling's really helpful, getting your thoughts out on the paper. But actually, for a lot of people, I always used to get up a little bit early in the morning. I still do sometimes when I'm not poorly, get up in the morning, do a little bit of journaling. But I know that if I don't get up early, I know that if I've got to be out the house earlier, I'm going to miss it. So how do you fit it in when that's not realistic? And we do sometimes put pressure on us whilst we are trying to do those things that we think will help almost fix us, and that's not the
Mhm.
goal.
Absolutely not. If we add all that pressure and expectation to it, we're not going to get the most from those practices.
Mm.
So what I've started to do with my journaling as an example is that I'll do it now when I get to work. So I have the busy school rush,
Hmm.
do all of that bit, and then I almost restart my morning. So I get to the office and I'll make myself a cup of tea and I'll spend 5 minutes then kind of resetting those intentions, grounding myself into that day of work. So whatever happened before I got to work, kind of, I'm refocusing that, I'm regrounding myself, I'm giving myself that opportunity then to just really calmly come into that space and then, restart my day in that space rather than rushing from one space, rushing to another, and continuing that. And that for me has really helped to kind of reduce that expectation and pressure.
Mm.
And if I don't do it, because actually I've not done it this morning, um, I'm just going to pick it up later. I might do it on my lunch break instead.
Yeah.
Also, I think with things like that, it's really useful to leave it out. So you've kind of got that visual reminder of actually, and I know that that's something I want to do today rather than I need to. I want to do that today
Yeah.
because of the impact it's going to have. So if it's there and I notice that it's there, I'm more likely to come back to it when I've got a couple of minutes. And I think that bit's really key, isn't it? If we started journaling and just doing a couple of minutes, maybe setting our intentions for how we want to feel that day, or maybe reflecting on, what went well or what could have gone even better the day before, and how we might want to use that learning in our next day. If we've done that bit, we can always come back later and write more. It
Yeah.
doesn't then need to be, well, I've done it, that's it. If we feel like we do need to write some more, or that maybe there's something that, is going on that we really want to explore, and actually we need that kind of more dedicated time to do it, well, let's do that as well. But that's when we start doing it, just keep it really, really simple so that we can build those healthy habits. I think also when we talk about self-care, absolutely anything could be self-care. We are all so different. Our lives are so different. Where we are at in the chapter and season of our life is so different. And so it's about finding things that really work for you in that space. And that might be different from what works for you, or works for me, or works for
Mm.
somebody else. However, that can also feel challenging in itself, can't it? Like, oh,
Yeah.
there's all these things, like, what do I pick? Actually, let's come at it from a space of, I'm going to try and I'm going to see, I'm going to experiment. And if it doesn't work how I expected it to, that's okay. We can try again,
Mhm.
something different tomorrow, or maybe we just need to change it up. A lot of my clients used to love reading. And I
Mm.
say used to because then life became busy, and actually, reading a chapter an evening can be quite unachievable in the space they're in right now. So why don't we change that up and just read a page? Or just try and read a page. If we get no further, that's absolutely fine. Or if that is really difficult and actually you know it's something that is really important to you, why don't we just listen to an audiobook for a
Yeah.
bit? And
Mhm.
let's just, really change it up in a way that actually we're still getting, what is really good for us and makes us, feel that joy, have that energy. We might just need to tweak it a little bit to fit into where we are right now.
I completely agree with you there. And I think I'm a big reader, big reader. And I absolutely love just being able to settle down with a book. But audiobooks are something that before I had kids, I can say hand on heart, I never listened to an audiobook. And now I'll put an audiobook on whilst I'm doing dinner. I'll put a podcast on whilst I'm doing dinner. It's those little things that we don't think of as self-care, that it's about reframing. And I think so much of our lives as cycle breakers is about reframing the
Hmm.
things we've given. I often think about cycle breaking parenting in particular as picking up the blueprint that you've been given, because we all have one from our parents, from our past generations, picking it up, looking at it, and almost chucking it out the window and saying,
Hmm.
okay, what am I going to do? How am I going to create my blueprint? How am I going to start with this? And that's so much pressure. It's so much pressure for anyone to take on their shoulders to not just have the blueprint and have to disregard it, but to have to unlearn all of that. So it is really important that we are self-caring whilst we do these things, whatever that might look like, and kind of letting go of that expectation of what we think self-care might look like, what we expect it to be. It might not be sitting in a bubble bath and reading a book for half an hour whilst the kids play. I have done that whilst my daughter's laying on the floor next to me listening to her iPad.
Hmm.
And again, that was a reframe, because people will tell you, oh no, for it to be for you, needs to have candles, needs to be relaxed. No, it didn't. I just needed to be able to sit and read my book and enjoy for half an hour. And yeah, that meant that I was listening with Peppa Pig in the background at the time. But okay, we got
Hmm.
it done. We got it done in some form, and that was okay. It was like a halfway house.
Hmm.
We got there. Yes, I might be doing dinner whilst I'm listening to an audiobook. And sometimes the audiobooks, okay, I might have to put headphones in for them, because otherwise I get side eye from the teenager who's like, "Oh, really? Really, Mum? That's what's on? Why are we listening to that?" There's a limit to how much true crime you could listen to, or how many fantasy smut novels you can get away with whilst your kids are like, Mum. So I think sometimes it's making those little tweaks. I know you mentioned that you talk with a lot of your clients about boundaries and putting them in place. And I think that's a very overlooked form of self-care that is extremely important for cycle breakers, because we, most of us, have been brought up being taught that boundaries are either the devil, and then it makes you selfish, it makes you a bad person, it makes you some kind of awful to your parent, that putting those boundaries in is such a bad thing to do. Or we've been completely the opposite and we've been pushed away, and we've had to then be the one that's trying to cling on in some fashion. So, can you talk to me a little bit about boundaries?
Yeah, of course. So I think in all aspects of our life, they're really important, aren't they? I know,
Mm,
as well as when we're trying to break those cycles, when we're trying to create that new blueprint. And actually, they need to come from a space of us, I guess, really working out what it is that we want and what we're okay with,
mhm,
and
mhm,
ultimately then what we're not okay with. And with clients, I'll often start with looking at our values. So that's really look at our, values of what is truly, absolutely, truly important to us. And that might be in different contexts of our lives. So it might be in that specific situation and that specific context, or it might be across all of our, contexts of our life in general. And when we can work out what those top values are and we have that information, because everything's information, isn't it? And we can learn from that
yeah.
information and we can use that then to make really informed decisions about what we want to do and how we want to move forward in a way that's right for us. So once we know that, we can then start to look at where perhaps things are really, conflicting against those values. And then what do we need to do about that? So is it something that actually is something we need to do something about? Or is it perhaps something that we don't need to do something about? And then when it is something that we do need to do something about, it's about putting those really clear boundaries in. This is what I need in order for me to be okay
Hmm.
in that space, in that situation. And that can be really hard to do. It can feel really uncomfortable, can't it, to say, no, I'm not okay with that.
Yeah.
Or no, I don't want to do that right now. I want to do that when it's easier and fits in better for me.
Hmm.
And so that and being uncomfortable with it and moving to a space of them being comfortable with actually saying no, or wait a minute, like that's not how I want to do this. It takes time and it takes learning that behavior. And the first time we put that boundary in place and, whatever that boundary might be, you know, that's probably going to feel quite uncomfortable. And then maybe we're going to have some maybe reservations about what we've done and how we might move forward with that. Actually, the more we do it and the more that it is right for us in that space, the easier it's going to be. But it's all about learning, isn't it? Of actually, this is what I need to be okay. And whether that's right now or whether that is for the rest of my life, I need things to be this way for me. Yeah, I think the more we explore and learn about ourselves, the more we have that information, that knowledge of then how we can navigate our lives in a way that is right for us. And ultimately, then, you know, model that behavior for our children as well.
Yeah.
You know,
I think it's really important to model boundaries to our children. This is something
Mhm.
that I always say to my kids, even down to like knocking on the door,
Mhm.
little things like that, that people don't realize are helping your children to set boundaries, for them to be able to have a voice, without feeling fear of
Mhm.
expressing their opinion. When you talk about boundaries and finding out what those values are, that again, it's very common in coaching. That's something that I do with my own clients. But one thing that I've noticed, especially for people who've grown up in that toxic dynamic, that is really hard. And if
Mhm.
you're listening to this and you're thinking, right, but I don't know what my value, like how the hell do you work out what your values are when you've never been allowed to develop a sense
Mhm.
of self, an identity of your own? You've always had to fit in with whatever your parents' ideal was. I relate to that so, so much. And I would say 95% of my clients would also relate to that,
Mhm.
unless they have been and done the self work and worked out their own sense of identity. They have really struggled with finding those core values. So, what advice do you have for people who might be listening to that thinking, God, that just feels like so insurmountable? Because then it's hard for everybody. When people
Mhm.
say, what are your values? Everybody goes, everybody does it. But when you're a cycle breaker or you've had that toxic family dynamic and you've managed to come away from that and you've never been allowed to develop a sense of self, it's doubly difficult.
Mhm.
Sounds like a funny
Absolutely.
one, doesn't it? Doubly difficult. What a phrase. Yeah, it's doubly difficult.
No, I think you're so right because actually, when we don't know who we are, you know, there's a lot of working out there to do, isn't there, before you can even then start to dig deeper on the other stuff. And so if someone's listening, they're like, "Oh, Emma, come on, like, how am I going to do that?" Like, my one suggestion would just be to start to build that self-awareness,
Mm,
before anything else, start to listen. And when I say listen, like, I'm not talking about what's happening externally.
mhm,
Let's start to listen to what's happening internally for us when something happens. And that's probably going to feel uncomfortable too, because
mm,
we're not used to listening to, what's happening internally for us. You know, so many of us just focus on what's happening in our brain from a logical, practical level. And actually, we're not in touch with everything else that's happening internally for us. So if something happens, what's our response to that? How does that feel? What's the sensations that are happening in our body? Maybe, do we get stomach upset? What is happening? And so my first suggestion would just be start to be really curious
mm,
about what's happening for you. And that's where you could really beautifully bring the journaling in as well and just make a note of those things. Actually, when this happens, this is what happens for me. Let's be curious about that. What might that mean? And so that would be my first suggestion. Just sit and listen, you know,
Mm.
potentially then start to work with a coach and start to delve deeper because it is always so useful to have someone to hold your hand through that process and to kind of guide you through those steps. Because when we're not sure who we are, and that is a big thing, isn't it? Like our
Yeah.
identity and working out, with all of our life experiences, the blueprint, trying to break the cycles, potentially any trauma that we've experienced as well. Like, who are we? And who are we in this space right now? And so it can be also really useful to perhaps look at not revisiting stuff, but perhaps knowing your previous responses to things
Yeah.
and how
Hmm.
in this space now you perhaps respond differently. And then once you have that information, then you can start to dig deeper with it. But let's keep it super simple first and just start to notice and give yourself permission to notice as well, because all of that is simply just information that then you can, if you choose to, do something with.
Mm. I think that's really good advice is the start to notice thing. And I also say to people, if you can pull up a list of, you might just type in core value. Well, most of us are millennials, aren't we? So we might just type in core values onto Pinterest. And if you can type in core values or you can pull up a list on Google of core values, look through them. Have a look at things and see what stands out for you. What there, for me, it might be loyalty that comes up and thinks, oh, that's really important to me, is being able to feel like I'm loyal to something. Like for you, it could be so there's so many different things. But looking through that list and going, yeah, that sparks that emotion for me. That makes me think of this time, that makes me think of this occasion and why that upset me so much, perhaps when a partner did this, when a parent did this, whatever that might be. That's where you start to figure out what some of those core values are. And another trick that or another task, I guess, exercise that I've often reflected back to and I think is really quite useful is if you think about someone who you really admire. And it might be someone who is a family member, might be someone, not family member, it's probably not a family member, might be someone who is a friend or that you know personally, that you have some kind of experience with. Probably less useful if it's a celebrity because we don't really know them. But if you think about people that you do know or that you've come into contact with, what kind of things do you admire in them? What is it about them that you really like? They're probably your core values as well. I think that can be quite helpful, and it's not trying to force an identity with someone else or trying to mirror someone. It's just looking at, do you know what? I really admire that person and the things that they do and the way that they conduct themselves. That's probably because you share some core values, and that can be helpful in helping you get to know yourself a little bit better. And just jumping back to when you mentioned about boundaries with your children,
Mhm.
can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's really important, isn't it, that we start to kind of model that behavior that ultimately, we want them to be good humans, don't we? We want them to be able to say no to things they're not okay with, to be able to say yes to things they feel really passionately about.
Mm,
And I think also for other people to be aware of those boundaries as well.
yeah,
I came from a space when, my daughter was really little that actually she didn't want to hug you. I wasn't going to force her. Like,
yeah.
she can make that decision. She is her own person.
Hmm.
And, even now, like, I'm like, can I have a cuddle? And she's like, no. Like,
They're
not
so
now.
blunt, aren't they?
Yeah,
I'm busy.
yeah, I'm
Okay,
busy.
don't feel
Like,
needy.
um, but things like, knocking on the door,
Mm,
you know, before they burst in while you're on the loo or you're in the bath or whatever.
hmm.
Um, they're really simple things, aren't they? But ultimately, those behaviors are things that are going to help them be a really good human and also really look after themselves.
Mm,
Modeling those boundaries, modeling those self-care and how we absolutely, can care for ourselves while navigating life in a busy, demanding space and how those things are really going to support us. And, as you said before, they're things that we can do with our children, with those people in our lives. And all of that, is such a good way to show our children and also share with our children, how we can navigate life from a space of where we feel comfortable and we feel happy and we are doing things that we're okay with. Ultimately, in life, there's going to be things that we find more challenging.
Hmm.
Let's, share not the detail, obviously, unless it's appropriate to do so with our children, but let's, allow them to see those raw and vulnerable elements of us as well, because
Mm.
that's ultimately going to help them also share those raw and vulnerable elements of them with us as well. And having those really open and honest communication with them about, mummy does this because this is what helps mummy, or we're
Yeah.
not doing this because of. Um, I think that's really useful in some circumstances to have those conversations with them, to just be really clear. And so when we think about the boundaries, and we think about that from a self-care perspective, ultimately what we're really inviting them to do and really sharing with them is it's okay for me to take care of myself.
Yeah.
That's really important. And these are the things that need to be in place for me to be able to do that. And you can ultimately have those things as well too. My daughter, she's 6.5 now, and she will be like, Mummy, I just want to be on my own. I just want to go and colour.
Yeah. Mm.
Absolutely fine. Or at the moment, I want to watch Taylor Swift on the iPad, and that's fine if that's
Yeah.
what you want to do. And she'll just sit in bed, and she's like, "Mummy, come and sit with me." I'm like, I'll be there in a minute. We can sit and watch it together.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but ultimately, she's then learning actually that those are the things that she needs and she wants to do, and this is what she needs in order to be able to do that for herself. Um, I think, and they start to recognize, don't they, the impact that those things have as well. You
Yeah.
know, I had a conversation with her the other week about self-care and what does mummy do for self-care. She's like, mummy gets her nails done and mummy enjoys that. And often she'll come with me for that as well. Um, and then she's like, and mummy goes to the gym.
Mm.
And I was like, and what, I was like, is mummy a better mummy if mummy goes to the gym? And she's like, yes. And this like utter like, you have to go to the gym, mummy, because I know the difference it makes.
Yeah.
And even if they don't have the vocab for that, or the, understanding when they are that young, ultimately they're seeing the impacts that doing those things or setting those boundaries, you know, it is having on
Mm.
you as a parent.
Mm. And when it comes to setting boundaries and teaching your kids to do that, did you find any pushback when it was things like not wanting to have a hug right now from older family members?
Absolutely.
Mm.
So in the first few weeks of having it, I stopped people holding her.
Yeah.
And there was quite a bit of pushback on that. And, we explained it from a space of actually, right now, this is what we need.
Hmm.
We're navigating a baby who doesn't want to sleep, isn't feeding well, and right now just needs to be with her parents.
Yeah.
And if she is asleep, I'm not picking her up to pass her to somebody. She's asleep. And if she's asleep, that means I get rest.
Yeah.
And I was kind of very clear on that. That took a lot of courage and confidence and
Mm.
caused, it did cause quite a bit of, negative kind of feedback, I guess. Ultimately, that you make a decision, don't you, on what you feel is best in that
Yeah.
space for you and for your family. And if people are unable to accept that at the time, people came to accept it later on that actually, no, that was a situation that actually just needed to be as, was requested. Um, but I think, people will or, will do kind of what they feel is best, won't they? Or what they
Hmm.
feel they need in that space. And when you're navigating life with a new baby who doesn't want to do anything that you're trying to get them
Yeah.
to do,
Yeah.
ultimately, they don't come with the manual at all, do they? It's really, really hard. And I think you have to stick to what you've said you are going to do and stand firmly in that space, even though inside you might be absolutely, falling to pieces and really
Mm.
unsure of the decision. Ultimately, if you know in here in your heart that that is the right thing that you need to do, then that's the right thing that you need to do.
Yeah.
And I don't regret those decisions because she will run up to people now and hug them if she feels she wants to.
Mm.
And I got some rest.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that was what was important in that space.
Mm. And one of the things that I get asked a lot when we talk about boundaries on this podcast is how do you navigate the guilt? Because so many people struggle, especially when they've always had those messages that setting boundaries with family is the worst thing you can do. It's not right. Boundaries shouldn't be a thing. They're just arbitrary rules that cause
Mhm.
nothing but problems, even though we know that's absolutely not what they are. How do you navigate the guilt of setting those boundaries, of putting yourself first when you've always been taught that that's shameful?
I think that's really hard, isn't it? Because when we
Mm,
think about guilt, does the other person on the other side of it feel any guilt? Or are we just adding it to ourselves as extra pressure?
yeah,
And that, you know, I think when we start to see it from that perspective and we reframe it in that space, that actually, if we feel that we are doing the right thing for
hmm,
us, for our children, for our families, whoever it might be, ultimately adding that guilt in when it's really hard not to. And I'm not sitting here from a space saying it's not hard not to,
yeah,
because it definitely is, even if you have that awareness of actually it doesn't serve me, and actually the person on the other side of that probably has no idea
mm,
that
mm,
you're even attaching guilt to it. Um, it's so easy to say that, isn't it? But ultimately, then we do feel that space and we do feel that guilt. So I think it's what we do with that guilt more so of actually recognizing it and having that awareness of, well, actually, why do I feel that way?
mm.
Is it because, I've always said yes to things and I've been a people pleaser and I'm trying to fit into the space I was before, and now I'm trying to do something different, so it feels uncomfortable.
Yeah,
And then having that acknowledgement and awareness of actually, okay, well, I do feel guilty about it. However, this is the right thing that I
yeah,
needed to do. And so actually sitting in that guilt isn't going to serve me. That's if we can park it to one side because it's not going to go anywhere. We've got to learn to
yeah,
kind of work with that. And that's, move on into the next part of our day. Ultimately, I don't think we're ever going to escape that guilt. We could say the same thing about mum guilt, couldn't we? And we're going out and
mm,
taking care of ourselves and our children are at home with whoever. Actually, they have no awareness of the fact that we feel guilty about that.
mm,
And so it's what we do with that actually, because we don't need to carry that around with us. And that's easier said than done, obviously.
yeah.
Um,
But I quite like the idea, though, of kind of parking it to the side and being
yeah.
aware that it's there, saying, okay, I acknowledge that I feel really guilty about setting boundaries with family. I feel really guilty about setting boundaries in general. They're so uncomfortable. It's so difficult. I hate the way that I feel. And I think for a lot of people listening, if they have that toxic family dynamic, some of those parents are very aware that you have that guilt and they really play into it and they encourage it and they push it on you. But it's taking it, saying, yeah, I'm aware that this is here, and that's okay. I
Mhm,
can't stop it in its tracks. I've not got some magical wand to wave to say I'm not going to feel guilty about this, or to say I'm going to let it go and be free. That's not
mhm,
realistic, and that's okay. It's
mhm,
here. I'm putting it to a side and acknowledging that whilst I am very guilty about this and I'm really struggling with it, it's the right thing for my
mhm,
family. It's the decision I've committed to and I feel most confident in,
mhm,
even if it's making me feel awful and it makes me feel like such a bad daughter or it makes me feel like a bad mother, whatever that might be. I see it, I acknowledge it, and I'm going to put it to the side
mhm,
and continue on. And acknowledging that it's in that space, but not letting it change our decision or influence our decision,
mhm,
because that's where the problem starts. I have so many people who say to me, well, I cut contact with my mum because of her behavior. I couldn't have her in my space. The way she treated me was awful, but I felt really guilty about the kids. And when I had my child, I felt like I had to reintroduce the contact, and I did. But actually, now I've noticed my mum does a lot of the things that she did with me, with my kids. And I know the right thing for all of us is for her not to be in our lives, but I feel so guilty. or I'm taking away her only grandchildren, or I'm doing this. And that's your guilt speaking. And
Mhm.
seeing it, acknowledging it, and saying, yeah, I see you, I get it, I'm going to feel guilty about this. But ultimately, I've weighed it up and I know this is the right decision for me.
Absolutely. And that is, coming back to what we said before about having that self-awareness, isn't it? Of
Mm,
and building our, I guess, trust in that and understanding of that, of actually, okay, this is the right thing for me, for my family.
yeah.
I'm potentially still going to feel that way. Ultimately, having that in the kind of the middle of everything, as
Mm,
such, if we think about our, feelings and we're going to then move it to the side, we're going to park it. If we leave it sat in the middle and then it's interrupting everything else and affecting then how we navigate our day, it's ultimately going to have more impact, isn't it? So let's just park it. If we feel we need to explore it further at a later date, we can come back to it if
yeah.
if we need to. But ultimately, if we feel like we're making the right decision, then trust that.
Mm,
Absolutely trust that because that is that, absolute understanding and learning of who we are and who we want to be in those spaces. And it will get easier over time.
yeah. I think that's the important message, isn't it? Is that it does get easier over time. It's the guilt kind of lessens. And at first, it doesn't feel like it will. When I first cut contact with my mum, I felt like the most horrendous daughter in the world. Like I must be the worst daughter in the world. Forget the fact that I'd done so many things that I can now reflect on and be like, crikey, you really were a doormat there. You know, you did this, you did that, you did the other. I've probably been a bit unfair to myself there because that again is negative self-talk, isn't it? But
Mhm.
I did so much that I look back on and I'm like, wow, you really did so much. But I still felt like the worst daughter in the world for finally saying, this is enough. I can't keep doing this. And it's important for us to acknowledge that that is there, park it, and realize that actually over time, with that self-awareness, things will get better. And that's the big overriding message is with that self-awareness, with taking care of yourself, be that setting boundaries and teaching your children to take care of themselves and to see value in themselves, that is going to get less, that guilt over time. Emma, thank you so much for chatting to me today. Despite both of us being really sinusy, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Can you
Thank
let people
you.
know where they can find you?
Yes, of course. So I'm over on Instagram and Facebook at emmabenyon.coach, and my website is emmabenyoncoaching.co.uk. And you can also find me over on the Self Care and Motherhood Edit podcast too.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Right, guys, I will hopefully next recording that I do, I will not sound like this and I will feel better. And I will speak to you again next week. Bye.